There are women who are born into beauty the way other people are born into poverty. It defines everything, opens certain doors, closes others, and follows them into rooms they never asked to enter. And then there are women who transcend the thing that first made the world notice them, who become something so much larger and more complicated than a face or a figure, that by the time you finally understand them, you realize you were never looking at the right thing to begin with. What happens to a goddess when the world she built her life inside begins to crack? What does a woman do with 91 years of living? The war, the hunger, the humiliation, the love so enormous it broke every rule to survive, when suddenly the body that carried all of it begins to fail. And what is the real story behind the fall that shook her family and sent her fans around the world reaching for something to hold on to? She has been called the most beautiful woman who ever lived. She has an Academy Award. She has the kind of face that painters would have wept to capture in another century. But the story that matters, the one that will stay with you long after this video ends, is not about beauty at all. It is about a little girl in a bombed city, hungry and nameless and absolutely refusing to disappear. She was born Sophia Loren on September 20th, 1934, in a charity ward of a clinic in Rome, Italy. Not the Rome of the tourist photographs. Not the Rome of fountains and golden light and languorous afternoon meals. The Rome of 1934 was a city under Mussolini's shadow, a country tightening around the throat of its own people, and the circumstances of her birth were not romantic by any definition of the word. Her mother, Romilda Villani, was a young woman of striking looks and considerable musical talent who had once been told she resembled Greta Garbo. Romilda had dreamed of the cinema, of escape, of a life that was larger than the one her circumstances offered. Instead, she fell in love with Riccardo Ciccolone, a man who refused to marry her, who gave her 2 daughters and almost nothing else, who remained a ghost at the edges of a family he declined to officially join. Sophia grew up in Pozzuoli, a small volcanic town outside Naples, in the home of her maternal grandparents. Pozzuoli was poor the way that southern Italian poverty is poor, not just materially, but in a way that gets into the light, that makes everything feel provisional and uncertain, that teaches children very early that the ground beneath their feet is not guaranteed. The town sits on what geologists call the Campi Flegrei, a supervolcanic field, and the earth there literally moves, shifts, releases sulfurous breath through cracks in the ground. There is something almost mythological about the idea that Sophia Loren grew up on ground that could not hold still, on earth that was always becoming something else. Her grandmother's house was crowded and loud and full of the particular energy of people who have very little and must make something from it every single day. Her grandfather made wine. Her grandmother held everything together with the ferocity that southern Italian grandmothers have been holding things together with since before recorded history. And Romilda, her mother, beautiful, restless, disappointed Romilda, was always there but also always slightly elsewhere, her attention divided between the children in front of her and the life she hadn't been allowed to have. Sophia was a thin child, painfully thin by her own later accounts, in a way that earned her a nickname from the neighborhood children that translated roughly to little stick or toothpick. She was not, in those early years, considered particularly beautiful. She was angular and serious, and she had a nose that the people around her were not shy about commenting on. She ate whatever there was, which was often not much, and she grew up understanding hunger not as a metaphor, but as a physical companion, something that sat beside her in the classroom and walked her home. Then the war arrived. World War II reached Pozzuoli not as an abstraction, but as a physical catastrophe. Allied bombing of the nearby area, the strategic necessity of destroying German positions, meant that explosions were not distant sounds, but immediate, earth-shaking, window-shattering facts of life. The family took shelter where they could. There were nights in tunnels, nights in makeshift shelters, nights when the sky above the town was lit with a terrible orange glow that meant something was burning and you prayed it was not something you loved. Sophia Loren has spoken about these years with a specificity that makes clear they never left her nervous system. The hunger. The sound of bombs. The instinct developed very young to scan a situation for danger, to calculate the distance between herself and whatever was coming, to be ready to move. This is not the biographical backdrop of a movie star. This is the formation of a survivor, of a woman whose elegance would always rest on a foundation of iron. The defining wound of her life arrived not with a crash, but with an absence. It came in the form of her father, Riccardo Ciccolone, the man who would not claim her. Riccardo was not a monster in the cinematic sense. He was simply a man who had decided that his obligations to this woman and these children were negotiable. He had a legitimate family elsewhere, or the idea of one, or at least a life he preferred to be living. He appeared occasionally, inconsistently, and his appearances were more destabilizing than his absences because they kept hope alive in the form that is most painful. The almost. When Sophia was older, she used his name. She took Ciccolone rather than using her mother's surname, because having a father's name, even a father who barely acknowledged you, opened certain doors in a society that was deeply attentive to such distinctions. The transaction of it, using the name of a man who would not use you, is the kind of quiet indignity that lives inside a person and becomes, over time, a source of energy. Not the warm kind, the cold, clean, determined kind. She has said in interviews that she never really had a father. She said it plainly, without much drama, which somehow made it worse. The matter-of-fact quality of her acceptance of it. This was the shape of my childhood. This was what was true. Speaks to how early she learned to calibrate her expectations of the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. The lowest point of her early life arrived when the war ended and peace turned out to be its own kind of devastation. Potswally in the late 1940s was rubble and hunger and hundreds of thousands of people trying to rebuild something from almost nothing. The Marshall Plan was coming, but it had not arrived yet. And in the south of Italy especially, the aftermath of the war felt like the war itself with different sounds. Romilda, desperate and resourceful in equal measure, entered Sophia in a beauty contest in 1948 in Naples. Sophia was 13 years old, still thin and angular, not yet grown into the architecture of her face. She did not win. She was a runner-up, which is the specific category of near miss that tells you the direction to walk without quite showing you the door. But Romilda had understood something. She had looked at her thin, serious, large-eyed daughter and seen what the daughter herself had not yet seen. That this child was becoming something. That the bones of her face were arranging themselves into an argument that the world was going to have difficulty ignoring. They moved to Rome. This was the gamble. Rome in 1950 was the center of what would become the Italian film industry's golden age, and Romilda aimed her daughter at it with the focused intensity of a woman who has redirected all of her own frustrated ambition into the next generation. They had almost no money. They lived in circumstances that required constant improvisation. And Sophia, who was now 16, began making the rounds. Beauty contests, small magazine work, bits in films where she was part of the background. She was not discovered. That is the wrong word, the Hollywood word, the word that implies passivity. She presented herself, again and again, to an industry that was not quite ready to understand what it was looking at. And then she met Carlo Pani. Carlo Pani was a film producer, 22 years older than Sophia, already established, already respected, possessed of the kind of eye for talent that can see what something will become before it has arrived there. He saw her in 1950 at one of those beauty contests that lined the path of her early career, and he understood immediately that she was extraordinary in a way that would not be contained by the limitations of where she currently was. He became her manager. And then something more complicated than that. And eventually, after an odyssey of bureaucratic and legal obstacles that would consume years of their lives, her husband. But that came later. In the early 1950s, he was the person who looked at Sophia Ciccolone and said, "I know what you could be. Let me help you get there." She changed her name. Sophia Ciccolone became Sophia Loren, a name constructed partly from the name of the Swedish actress Marta Torén, rearranged and Italianized into something that sounded both foreign and inevitable. The new name was a kind of declaration, a shedding of the old skin, a decision that the girl from Swally who had eaten very little and been claimed by almost no one was going to become someone else entirely. Or, more accurately, was going to become fully herself. The early films were not great art. They were the kind of films that a beautiful young woman with almost no training made in 1951 and 1952, commercial, populist, designed to showcase a figure and a face. But within them, even then, even in the least serious of them, there was something that the camera could not stop finding. A quality of presence that went beyond the physical, a warmth and an intelligence that came through even when the material did not deserve it. Italy noticed her first, then the world. By the mid-1950s, Sophia Loren was one of the biggest stars in Italian cinema, and Hollywood was circling with the particular hunger of an industry that always wants to import what it cannot manufacture at home. Cary Grant made a film with her in 1957, The Pride and the Passion, and then Houseboat in 1958, and the two of them together, his studied elegance and her volcanic naturalism, created a chemistry that audiences found irresistible. Grant reportedly fell genuinely in love with her. She has never denied the complexity of those years, but the role that changed everything, that elevated her from movie star to something approaching art, came in 1960. La Ciociara, directed by Vittorio De Sica, released in English as Two Women, required her to play a mother in wartime Italy, a woman who witnesses an atrocity committed against her daughter, a woman who must survive something that no mother should have to survive. It was not the role of a beautiful woman. It was the role of a human being at the absolute limit of what human beings can bear. She reached into herself for that role and pulled out everything. The hunger she remembered, the bombs, the specific quality of fear that lives in the body of a child who is not safe, the love that a mother carries for a daughter that is beyond language and beyond reason. She did not perform the grief in that film. She excavated it. On April 9th, 1962, Sophia Loren became the first actress to win the Academy Award for Best Actress for a non-English language performance. She was not there. She was in Rome, too anxious to attend, convinced she would not win. When the news arrived by telephone in the early hours of the Italian morning, she wept. She has said that she wept for a long time, that the award represented something that reached all the way back to Swally, to the hunger, to the nickname, to the father who would not claim her. The Oscar sits somewhere in her home. But it is not a trophy. It is a conversation between who she was and who she became. The scandal that threatened to reframe everything did not involve another actor or a tabloid romance. It was something simultaneously more banal and more devastating. A legal battle with the Italian tax authorities that resulted in Sophia Loren being arrested in 1982 on charges of tax evasion. Let that land for a moment. One of the most celebrated women in the world, a woman who had given her country its most iconic international face, was handcuffed and taken to Caserta prison. She spent 17 days there. She has described those days with a precision that suggests she has never stopped processing them. The smell of the place, the sound of the locks, the particular humiliation of being reduced, in the eyes of the legal system, to a case number. She maintained throughout that the charges were politically motivated, that the financial arrangements made by her husband Carlo Pani had been misrepresented. But the details of the legal argument were almost irrelevant to the experience of those 17 days. What mattered was the reduction, the taking away, the demonstration that fame and beauty and international acclaim are not protections against the mechanisms of power when those mechanisms have decided to move against you. She walked out of that prison the same woman who walked in, and also completely changed. There is a before and after to Sophia Loren, not the arrest itself, but what it confirmed about the fragility of everything that the world had offered her. The knowledge, once again, that the ground she was standing on was not guaranteed, that she was, as she had always been, standing on that volcanic earth in Swally, where the land itself cannot be trusted to remain still. And then, as she has done at every significant rupture in her life, she went back to work. The reinvention of Sophia Loren in the decades that followed the prison experience was not a calculated career strategy. It was simpler and more human than that. She kept making films. She wrote a cookbook, Sophia Loren's Recipes and Memories, published in 1998, that was not just about food, but about memory, about the specific gravity of meals shared and people lost, about the way that cooking is a form of love made physical. The book was her, in the way that Los Ciociaro was her, completely unguarded, specific, grounded in the sensory reality of her actual life. She appeared in Robert Altman's Pret-a-Porter in 1994. She received a Grammy for the Italian-language album Mama in 1999. She made 9 on Broadway in 2003. She starred in a Netflix film The Life Ahead in 2020 when she was 85 years old, and her performance earned her a Golden Globe nomination and a wave of critical reconsideration that felt less like rediscovery and more like acknowledgement. The world finally catching up to something it had always undervalued.